You just won a $70,000 tournament. The cameras are on you. Your rail is celebrating. Social media is blowing up with congratulations. And inside your head, there's a voice whispering, "They're going to figure out I don't belong here. This was just luck. I'm not actually this good." Welcome to the most invisible opponent in poker, the one that nobody talks about at the table, but nearly every professional battles in their mind. It's called imposter syndrome, and it's systematically destroying the careers of players who have every right to be exactly where they are. Here's what makes this so insidious. Research shows that up to 80% of high performers experience imposter syndrome at some point. Think about that. 8 out of 10 elite athletes, top executives, and yes, professional poker players secretly believe they're frauds. But here's the twist that nobody tells you. Imposter syndrome doesn't attack the weak players. It targets the strong ones. It feeds on achievement. The more you win, the louder it gets. I need you to understand something right now. If you've ever sat at a high-stakes table and felt like you didn't deserve to be there, if you've ever won a tournament and attributed it to luck rather than skill, if you've ever looked at successful players and thought, "They have something I don't," you're not alone. You're experiencing one of the most common psychological patterns in competitive performance. And more importantly, you can weaponize this knowledge to turn your biggest mental liability into your greatest competitive advantage. Let me break down what's actually happening in your brain when imposter syndrome strikes. This isn't some vague emotional problem. This is a specific psychological phenomenon with identifiable patterns, and once you understand the machinery, you can dismantle it. Imposter syndrome was first identified in the 1970s by psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. They initially thought it only affected high-achieving women, but decades of research proved them wrong. This beast is an equal opportunity destroyer. It hits men, women, young players, veterans, amateurs turning pro, and even world champions. Stephen Chidwick, voted best poker player in the world in 2019, publicly discussed his battles with severe mental health challenges throughout his career. Brad Rubin, a 5-time WSOP bracelet winner, has openly shared his struggles. Angela Jordison, named Breakout Player of the Year, admitted how difficult it was to give herself proper credit even while crushing the game. These aren't weak players with fragile egos. These are some of the most successful professionals in the world. And they all battled the same voice in their head, telling them they didn't truly belong. If you've ever felt this way, drop a comment right now and let me know. Because recognizing this pattern is the first step to breaking free from it. And trust me, we're about to go deep on how to turn this around. Here's what imposter syndrome actually is. It's a persistent belief that your success is undeserved, that you've somehow fooled people into thinking you're competent, that at any moment you'll be exposed as a fraud. And the terrifying part? Evidence of your competence doesn't cure it. In fact, it often makes it worse. You win a tournament, and instead of building confidence, you think, "I just got lucky with the card distribution." You make a brilliant play, and you tell yourself, "Anyone would have done that." You get staked at higher levels, and you're convinced your backer made a mistake. This is what psychologists call intellectual self-doubt despite external validation. Your results say one thing, but your internal narrative says something completely different. And that gap, that disconnect between objective reality and subjective experience, is where performance starts to crumble. Now let's connect this to the unique torture chamber that is professional poker. Because poker is almost designed to trigger imposter syndrome. Think about the specific characteristics of this game. First, there's massive variance. You can play perfectly and lose. You can play terribly and win. Short-term results are essentially random. This creates what researchers call attribution ambiguity. When you win, you can always attribute it to luck. When you lose, you can always attribute it to lack of skill. Imposter syndrome thrives in this ambiguity. It hijacks your attribution system, making you credit external factors for success and internal factors for failure. Second, poker is a game of incomplete information. You never know for certain if you made the right play. That river call could have been brilliant or terrible, and sometimes you'll never know. This uncertainty is psychological quicksand for someone battling imposter thoughts. You can't find solid ground because the game itself is built on probability and doubt. Third, the competition is visible and constant. You're not just playing against the cards. You're playing against other humans, many of whom appear confident, successful, and completely certain of their place at the table. You see their wins on social media. You hear about their big scores. You watch them play on streams, and your brain starts making comparisons. They seem so confident. They must actually know what they're doing. I'm the only one faking it. Except here's the truth. They're probably thinking the exact same thing about you. Fourth, poker culture has a weird relationship with ego and humility. Players who show too much confidence get labeled as arrogant or tilted. Players who show doubt get labeled as weak or scared. So everyone learns to project an image. Everyone's wearing a mask. And when you're battling imposter syndrome, you look at those masks and think they're real. You think everyone else actually feels the confidence they're projecting, and you're the only fraud in the room. Finally, and this is critical, poker success is measured in money. Every session, every tournament, every hand, there's a concrete dollar amount attached to your performance. This creates a unique psychological pressure. In most careers, you can have a bad day and nobody knows. In poker, your bad day is measured in buy-ins. Your mistakes are quantified in big blinds. Your lack of confidence costs you literally measurable money. This creates a feedback loop where imposter thoughts directly impact your bankroll, which reinforces the imposter thoughts, which impacts your bankroll worse. Professional poker player and author Maria Konnikova documented her journey from complete beginner to tournament champion, and she explicitly discussed working with a psychologist to overcome imposter syndrome, insecurity, and lack of self-esteem. She recognized these weren't just annoying thoughts. They were creating actual leaks in her game, triggering poor decisions at critical moments. Here's what imposter syndrome looks like in action at the poker table. You're playing well, building a stack, making good decisions. Then you get moved to a table with recognized pros. Immediately, your internal dialogue shifts. These players are real. I'm going to get destroyed. Your play tightens up. You start second-guessing decisions you would make confidently at another table. You fold spots you should call. You check spots you should bet. Not because the game theory changed, but because your perception of your right to be there changed. Or you're deep in a tournament. You've navigated hundreds of players. You're at the final table. And instead of recognizing this as evidence of skill, your brain tells you, I've been lucky so far, but now I'm going to pay for it. You start playing not to lose instead of playing to win. You make scared decisions. You give away your edge. And when you bust, your brain says, see, I told you I didn't belong here. Or you're running bad. Variance is crushing you. Every time you get your money in good, you lose. And even though you know intellectually that variance is part of poker, your imposter voice uses this as evidence. Real pros don't run this bad. Maybe I'm not actually making good decisions. Maybe I've been fooling myself about my skill level. This is the hell of imposter syndrome in poker. It turns the game's inherent uncertainty into a weapon against yourself. Now that you understand what imposter syndrome is and why poker amplifies it, let's talk about the psychological architecture underneath. Because once you see how this machine operates, you can take it apart piece by piece. The foundation of imposter syndrome is what psychologist Albert Bandura called self-efficacy. This is one of the most researched concepts in performance psychology, and understanding it will change everything for you. Self-efficacy isn't general confidence. It's your belief in your ability to execute a specific task in a specific situation. You could have high self-efficacy for playing cash games, but low self-efficacy for tournament final tables. You could believe in your pre-flop game, but doubt your river decision-making. It's task-specific, situation-specific, and absolutely critical for performance. Here's what the research shows. Self-efficacy is a stronger predictor of performance than actual skill level. Read that again. Your belief in your ability matters more than your objective ability. Two players with identical technical knowledge will perform drastically differently based on their self-efficacy. The player who believes they can execute under pressure will access their knowledge and make quality decisions. The player who doubts themselves will choke, even though they know exactly what to do. Bandura identified 4 sources that build or destroy self-efficacy. Understanding these is like having the blueprint to your own confidence architecture. First, mastery experiences. This is the most powerful source. When you successfully execute a difficult task, you build what I call a mental receipt, proof that you can do it. This is why progressive skill development matters so much. You don't jump straight to high-stakes tournaments. You build a foundation of mastery at each level. Each successful navigation of a tough spot, each correctly executed bluff, each disciplined fold. These are deposits in your self-efficacy bank. But here's where imposter syndrome sabotages this system. It invalidates your mastery experiences. You make a brilliant play, and instead of banking that as evidence of competence, you dismiss it. That was obvious. Anyone would have done that. I got lucky they had that exact hand. You're literally refusing to collect your mental receipts. You're achieving mastery but not allowing yourself to experience it psychologically. The second source is vicarious experience. Watching others similar to you succeed. This is why study groups and coaching matter beyond just technical learning. When you see a peer, someone you perceive as being at your level, successfully navigate a situation, it raises your belief that you can do it too. But imposter syndrome corrupts this as well. You watch successful players, and instead of thinking, they're like me, so I can do that too, you think, they're better than me, which proves I don't belong. The third source is social persuasion. Credible feedback from people you respect. When a coach, a mentor, or a respected player gives you specific positive feedback, it should boost your self-efficacy. But what does imposter syndrome do? It makes you discount or dismiss that feedback. Someone tells you, that was an excellent read, and you think they're just being nice, or they don't know what they're talking about. You reject the very input that could build your belief in yourself. The fourth source is emotional and physiological states. How you interpret your body's signals. When your heart races before a big decision, you can interpret that as anxiety. I'm scared. I can't handle this. Or as excitement. I'm alert. I'm ready. This is game time. Same physical sensation, completely different interpretation, and the interpretation directly impacts your self-efficacy. Imposter syndrome hijacks all 4 sources. It invalidates your mastery, corrupts your vicarious learning, makes you reject social persuasion, and causes you to misinterpret your physiological states. It's a systematic attack on the very foundations of performance confidence. Now let's talk about the specific patterns imposter syndrome creates. Understanding these will help you catch yourself in the act. The first pattern is attributional distortion. When something good happens, you attribute it to external factors. When something bad happens, you attribute it to internal factors. You win because you got good cards. You lose because you're not skilled enough. This creates a psychological trap where nothing you do can prove your competence. The second pattern is perfectionism. Imposter syndrome often pairs with unrealistic standards. You hold yourself to a level of performance that's literally impossible. Every mistake becomes evidence of fraud. Every imperfect decision proves you don't belong. But here's the truth. The best players in the world make mistakes constantly. Phil Ivey makes mistakes. Daniel Negreanu makes mistakes. The difference is they don't use those mistakes to invalidate their entire competence. They learn and move forward. The third pattern is discounting praise. When someone compliments your play, you immediately minimize it. This serves a psychological function. If you dismiss the praise, you don't have to live up to it. If you accept the praise, you feel pressure to maintain that standard, and that pressure feels threatening to someone who already doubts themselves. So you reject the praise to protect yourself from future failure. except this protection is actually self-destruction. The fourth pattern is fear of being found out. This is the core terror of imposter syndrome. You're convinced that eventually someone will realize you don't actually know what you're doing, so you avoid situations where you might be exposed. You don't play in tougher games because what if you get crushed and everyone sees? You don't stream your play because what if you make mistakes? You don't discuss strategy in depth because what if someone realizes you don't understand as much as they thought? This fear causes you to hide, and hiding prevents growth. The fifth pattern is overworking or underpreparing. These seem opposite, but they're two sides of the same coin. Some players with imposter syndrome study obsessively, grinding endless hours with solvers, because they're trying to prove to themselves they're not frauds. They think if they just learn enough, the feeling will go away. It doesn't. Others do the opposite. They underprepare as a form of self-sabotage. If they fail, they can tell themselves it's because they didn't prepare, not because they're incompetent. It's psychologically safer to fail due to lack of effort than to fail despite maximum effort. Here's a critical insight that most players miss. Imposter syndrome is often a sign you're in the right league. Let me explain. When you play against players significantly worse than you don't experience imposter thoughts. You know you're better. The self-doubt emerges when you're competing with peers or facing players slightly better than you. It's actually a signal that you're growing, that you're in the right level of challenge. But your brain misinterprets this signal as evidence of incompetence. A study on poker players found something fascinating. Professional players generally had low narcissism, low impulsivity, and high self-esteem on standard measures. But many still experienced imposter syndrome. This tells us something important. Imposter syndrome isn't about actual low self-worth. It's about a disconnect between your proven abilities and your perceived abilities. You can objectively be good, even great, and still feel like a fraud. Now, here's where this gets really interesting from a neuroscience perspective. Imposter syndrome creates measurable cognitive interference. When you're battling these thoughts, you're using mental bandwidth that should be allocated to strategic thinking. Part of your working memory is occupied with self-doubt instead of hand-reading. Part of your attention is on managing anxiety instead of tracking opponent patterns. This is a literal performance leak. Your brain is running two programs simultaneously, playing poker and defending against the belief that you can't play poker. This divided attention degrades decision quality. Research on high performers across multiple domains shows that those who manage imposter syndrome more effectively have developed what's called emotional granularity. Instead of just feeling bad or anxious, they can identify precisely, I'm feeling nervous because I'm at a tougher table, but this nervousness doesn't mean I'm incompetent. It means I'm appropriately alert to a challenge. That precision matters. When you label an emotion specifically, you engage your prefrontal cortex, which can then regulate it. When you just feel a vague sense of, I don't belong, it's much harder to address. Let me give you a framework that synthesizes all of this. I call it the competence perception gap. On one side, you have your actual competence, your real skills, knowledge, and abilities. On the other side, you have your perceived competence, what you believe about your capabilities. For most players, especially those battling imposter syndrome, perceived competence lags significantly behind actual competence. The gap is enormous. You're actually good, but you don't believe it. This gap has three major consequences. First, decision-making under pressure deteriorates. When you doubt your ability to execute a play, you hesitate, you second-guess, you make the scared decision instead of the optimal one. Second, learning efficiency decreases. If you don't believe you're capable of mastery, you don't engage with learning materials as effectively. You study, but you don't internalize. You review hands, but you don't trust your analysis. Third, career trajectory flattens. You avoid taking shots at higher stakes, you turn down opportunities, you stay in your comfort zone, not because you can't succeed at the next level, but because you don't believe you can. If this is hitting home for you, Comment below with the specific pattern you recognize most in yourself. Is it the attributional distortion, the perfectionism, the fear of being found out? Name it, because in Part 3, we're going to systematically dismantle each of these patterns with advanced techniques that elite performers use. Here's what you need to understand right now. Imposter syndrome is not a character flaw. It's not evidence that you actually are a fraud. It's a common psychological pattern that attacks high achievers. And more importantly, it's trainable. You can close the competence perception gap. You can build genuine self-efficacy that withstands pressure. You can turn this invisible opponent into a competitive advantage. The players who dominate at the highest levels aren't the ones who never experience self-doubt. They're the ones who've learned to manage it, to reframe it, and to perform brilliantly despite it. That's what we're building toward. That's the edge. Now we get to the real work. The practical, battle-tested strategies that transform imposter syndrome from a career-ending weakness into a manageable, even useful part of your competitive psychology. This isn't theory. This is what actually works when you're sitting at a final table with your heart pounding and that voice telling you that you don't belong there. Let's start with the most powerful intervention, the evidence log. This is a systematic approach to fixing your broken attribution system. Every day for the next 30 days, you're going to document 3 things. First, one specific decision you made well, not a hand you won. A decision. I correctly identified villain was overfolding to 3 bets and exploited it. Second, one piece of positive feedback you received from anyone. A rail comment, a coach observation, even an opponent saying, "Nice hand." Third, one situation where you handled pressure effectively, regardless of outcome. Maintained composure after bad beat, played next hand with full focus. This practice systematically rebuilds your self-efficacy. You're creating a library of mastery experiences that your brain can't dismiss because you've documented them. When imposter thoughts strike, you don't argue with them emotionally. You open your evidence log and confront the narrative with data. My brain is telling me I'm a fraud, but here's documented proof from the last 30 days that I've made excellent decisions, received credible positive feedback, and handled pressure situations competently. The narrative doesn't match reality. The second technique is attribution retraining. You're going to deliberately practice accurate attribution. When you win a hand, resist the urge to dismiss it as luck. Ask yourself, what specific decisions did I make that created this result? Did you isolate the right opponent? Did you barrel the right texture? Did you correctly assess their calling range? Document the skill, not just the outcome. When you lose a hand, resist the urge to catastrophize. Ask yourself, was my decision process sound? If I faced this exact situation 1,000 times, would I make the same play? If yes, the loss is variance, not incompetence. If no, it's a learning opportunity, not evidence of fraud. This requires brutal honesty, but here's the key. You're training your brain to separate process from results. Imposter syndrome thrives on results-oriented thinking. Good process with bad results triggers, "I'm not good enough." Good results with any process triggers, "I just got lucky." You're breaking that false connection. You're anchoring your self-assessment to what you can control, decisions, not outcomes. The third strategy is called competence mapping. Take a sheet of paper and create 4 quadrants. Label them. Things I'm genuinely good at, things I'm developing, things I need to learn, and things that are unknowable. Now, be specific about your poker skills. Maybe your pre-flop ranges are solid. That goes in genuinely good at. Maybe your river decision-making needs work. That goes in developing. Maybe you need to study ICM more deeply. That goes in need to learn. And here's the critical quadrant, unknowable. This includes things like whether I'll win this tournament or if my opponent is bluffing this specific time. This exercise does something powerful. It externalizes your competence assessment. You can look at it objectively. Most players with imposter syndrome, when they do this exercise, realize they have way more in the genuinely good at category than they thought. It also normalizes development. Every player, even world champions, has a developing and need to learn category. That's not evidence of fraud. That's evidence of growth. And the unknowable category is psychologically liberating. So much of what triggers imposter thoughts in poker is actually unknowable. Accepting that uncertainty is part of the game removes a massive source of self-doubt. The fourth intervention is exposure therapy for fear of being found out. You're going to deliberately put yourself in situations that trigger your imposter fears, but in controlled doses. If you're afraid of playing against pros, play one session with pros at lower stakes. If you're afraid of discussing strategy publicly, post one-hand analysis in a forum. If you're afraid of being on stream, play one stream tournament. The goal isn't to prove you belong. The goal is to survive the experience and realize the catastrophe you imagined doesn't happen. Most of the time, nobody's paying as much attention as you think. And when they do notice a mistake, the world doesn't end. You learn from it and move on. This technique leverages a fundamental principle. Avoidance maintains fear. Every time you avoid a situation because of imposter fears, you reinforce the belief that you can't handle it. But every time you face the fear and survive, you weaken its grip. You're building mastery experiences specifically around the situations that trigger your self-doubt. The fifth strategy is cognitive reframing through comparison context. Your brain is constantly comparing you to others, and imposter syndrome makes those comparisons toxic. You compare your behind-the-scenes struggles to everyone else's highlight reel. You compare your mistakes to others' best plays. You compare your uncertainty to their projected confidence. This is psychologically devastating and completely inaccurate. Here's the reframe. When you look at a successful player, remind yourself that you're seeing the result of thousands of hours of work, countless mistakes, and probably their own battles with self-doubt. You're not seeing the bad sessions, the busted tournaments, the strategy leaks they worked years to fix. Everyone you admire was once where you are, doubting themselves, grinding through uncertainty, building competence one decision at a time. Your comparison point should not be their current polish. It should be their journey. And your comparison to yourself should not be where you wish you were. It should be where you were 6 months ago, a year ago, 3 years ago. When you notice yourself comparing unfavorably, ask, am I better than I was 6 months ago? If yes, you're growing. That's literally the only comparison that matters. Growth, not perfection. Progress, not arrival. The sixth technique is building a competence feedback loop. This involves 3 components. First, you need a mentor or coach who can provide accurate, specific feedback on your play. Not generic praise, but detailed analysis. Your check-raise frequency on this texture is optimal, or your river calling range needs to be wider in this spot. This external calibration helps correct your distorted self-perception. Second, you need peers who are on a similar journey. People who understand the struggle, who can validate that self-doubt is normal, who can share their own battles with imposter thoughts. This breaks the isolation that makes imposter syndrome so powerful. Third, you need regular self-assessment rituals. Weekly hand review sessions where you objectively analyze your play. Monthly competence audits where you update your competence map. The seventh strategy is interpreting physiological arousal correctly. Remember, your body's stress response before a big decision isn't proof you can't handle it. It's your nervous system preparing you for peak performance. Your heart rate increases to deliver more oxygen to your brain. Your focus narrows to eliminate distractions. You get a surge of mental clarity. But imposter syndrome makes you interpret these sensations as fear or inadequacy. You need to practice reframing. This feeling means I'm ready. This is my body getting me into optimal state. This is what peak performance feels like. Before sessions, practice deliberately inducing and reframing this arousal. Do some intense physical exercise, then notice the physiological sensations: elevated heart rate, heightened alertness, physical tension. Now label it. This is readiness. This is power. This is my competitive state. You're literally training your brain to interpret these signals differently. Then, when they occur naturally at the table, you have a practiced response. The eighth intervention is what I call strategic self-disclosure. Part of what makes imposter syndrome so powerful is the belief that you are the only one experiencing it. The isolation amplifies the fear. Strategic self-disclosure means carefully sharing your struggles with trusted others, not complaining, not seeking empty reassurance, but genuinely discussing the experience. I notice I tend to attribute my wins to luck. Do you ever experience that? You'll be shocked how often the answer is yes. High-level players, successful professionals, people you respect, they're battling the same thoughts. This normalization is therapeutically powerful. You realize imposter syndrome isn't evidence of your inadequacy. It's a common experience among people pushing their limits. The ninth strategy is outcome independence training. This is advanced, but it's transformative. You're going to practice making decisions based purely on process, with zero attachment to outcome. Start small. In a low-pressure cash game, make a theoretically correct play that has high variance, maybe a river call that's slightly plus EV, but could easily be wrong. Make the play. Then, regardless of whether it works, consciously practice this thought. I made a sound decision based on available information. The outcome is variance. My competence is in the decision, not the result. This is incredibly difficult, especially when you lose. Your brain wants to use that loss as evidence, but you're training a new neural pathway. Competence lives in process, not outcomes. Over time, as you practice this in lower-pressure situations, you build the capacity to maintain it in high-pressure spots. You can make a huge final table bluff, have it fail, and not let that failure validate imposter thoughts. You recognize it as one data point in a probabilistic universe, not a verdict on your worthiness. The 10th and final strategy is embracing the growth identity. This is perhaps the most important mindset shift. Instead of trying to prove you belong, instead of trying to convince yourself you're already good enough, adopt a different frame. I'm someone who's committed to continuous growth. This is psychologically liberating because it removes the pressure of having arrived. You don't need to be the finished product. You don't need to know everything. You don't need to be mistake-free. You just need to be someone who's genuinely engaged in the process of getting better. This identity is actually more accurate than either the imposter identity or the supremely confident identity. The truth is, you're in the middle of a journey. You have genuine competence, and you have areas to develop. That's not fraud. That's growth. And growth is the actual identity of every elite performer. They're not people who've arrived at mastery and now coast. They're people who are obsessively committed to continuous improvement, who see every session as an opportunity to learn, who view mistakes as data rather than verdicts. Here's what all of this comes together to create: psychological flexibility under pressure. When imposter thoughts arise, and they will, you don't collapse under them. You recognize them. Ah, there's the imposter narrative again. You consult your evidence log. You remember your competence map. You reframe your physiological arousal. You anchor to your growth identity, and you make your decision anyway. The doubt is present, but it doesn't control you. This is what separates elite performers from everyone else. Not the absence of self-doubt, but the ability to perform brilliantly in its presence. Most players think they need to eliminate imposter thoughts before they can succeed at the highest level. That's backwards. You succeed at the highest level by developing the skills to operate effectively even when those thoughts are present. That's genuine mental toughness, not fearlessness, not supreme confidence, but the capacity to execute your edge even when your brain is feeding you doubt. This is Mind of Grinder. If this content resonated with you, if you recognize these patterns in yourself, if you're ready to stop letting imposter syndrome sabotage your potential, then subscribe right now. Hit that like button if you found value here, and drop a comment telling me which of these 10 strategies you're going to implement first. Because the players who dominate tomorrow are the ones who master their psychology today. I'll see you in the next one.